Hi guys! Today I wanted to talk about a few ways that your employer's arrogance can bite them in the butt at EEOC. If you're dealing with an arrogant employer, you probably know it. And by the end of this video, I think you're going to feel better about that. I'm going to be sharing some bits of my hearing that demonstrate how my attorney was able to use it in our favor. It may give you some ideas for your own hearing. NASA has a bit of a reputation for institutional arrogance. It contributed to the loss of 2 shuttles. The last one, Columbia, caught fire and broke apart on re-entry. On ascent, a 2-pound chunk of high-density foam had flown off one of the shuttle's big fuel tanks, and it impacted the ceramic leading edge of one of the shuttle's fragile wings, and left a crack. When the shuttle hit the 3,000-degree Fahrenheit plasma layer, it was able to get through the crack into the shuttle's primary structure, so the shuttle caught fire and broke apart. NASA managers knew the crack was there before they gave the go-ahead for re-entry. Quite a few engineers had gone on record warning against it, but the managers in charge didn't want to hear it, and they dismissed all those concerns with a simple analogy. They compared the foam strike to what might happen if you were driving down the freeway in your truck and the lid blew off a foam cooler in the back and hit the car behind you. Minimal damage, they said. This particular foam was high density. It wasn't exactly like the lid of a small foam cooler. And it flew off the truck at about 500 miles per hour, not exactly freeway speed. And it hit a thin ceramic coating, which is more like hitting a coat of paint than a whole car. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board summed it up like this: the foam did it, the institution allowed it. That's what institutional arrogance can look like at NASA. Managers can actually start to think that they can bend the laws of physics. And the really sad part is that I'm sure a lot of you have similar stories. So now let's get into the ways that arrogance can bite your employer in the butt. 1. Overconfidence. Arrogant people tend to overestimate themselves and underestimate everybody else. That can lead to their being ill-prepared. Very early in my process, when I just filed my complaint, I overheard my boss telling a coworker that I thought I was smarter than NASA, and I was about to learn I wasn't. I already knew I wasn't smarter than NASA. I wasn't intimidated by NASA because I'd worked there a long time and held my own just fine. But I never expected to beat them. I fought because I knew I'd regret it if I didn't. But I always knew the deck was stacked against me. So I knew if I was going to have any chance at all, I had a lot of work to do. I don't think my boss felt like she needed to work because she didn't think I had a chance either. Now my boss was ill-prepared for a few milestones on my claim, especially my hearing. Going into my hearing, my attorney had already figured out that my boss was a little bit arrogant. So when she started questioning her, the first thing she asked about were her credentials. And my boss set out to impress everybody with how much training she'd had on the reasonable accommodations process and how well she knew it. And after letting her brag for a little bit, my attorney started asking her specific questions about how she'd handled my claim. It soon became clear how little she knew about the process. It looked like she'd never even read the policy on it. For instance, when she was asked if NASA requires people to request reasonable accommodations in a specific written format using specific words, she answered with an enthusiastic yes, and then went freestyle, totally contradicting NASA's policy in a bunch of places. So when your boss brags about being an expert, my advice is to encourage them to elaborate on how great they are. And when they're done, move in with some hard questions that are going to test that expertise. If you can trip up a self-proclaimed expert with details, it'll hit their credibility. 2. Privilege. Privilege says that I have a right to whatever I want, no matter what you need. And that can mean that your employer feels like they have the right to do what they're doing. That can even lead them to admit some of the illegal stuff they're doing, because they don't believe they're doing anything wrong. From the very beginning, my boss talked a lot about her supervisory rights and her personal preferences. For instance, she had no problem admitting that even after she gave me telework as an accommodation, she didn't let me use it because her personal preference was that I use my sick leave instead. 3. Dishonesty. And of course, arrogance can also lead people to lie. And that can include painting a false image of themselves that starts to fall apart on closer examination. At my hearing, my boss presented as kind and concerned. Every question NASA asked her was touchy-feely, and sugar wouldn't melt in her mouth. My attorney questioned her actions, not her feelings. For instance, my boss had constantly repeated that I was AWOL, AWOL, AWOL. She'd been asked for evidence throughout the whole EEOC process. She didn't have any. But that didn't stop her from repeating the allegations every chance she got. AWOL is a serious charge, my attorney said. It's a fireable offense. And my boss agreed.
Did you ever document any of those serious allegations? No. Did EEOC ask you for proof? Mm-hmm. Did you provide it? No. If you were asked to provide it now, could you? No.
The boss we saw when my attorney was questioning what she'd done was not the same boss that we'd seen when NASA was asking her how she felt about accommodating me. The judge noticed the disconnect, and it hurt her credibility. So again, when your employer is trying to make your boss look good, let them. And then when they're nice and full of themselves, yank that rug out from under them by asking them some hard questions that are going to challenge that perfect image. You can do that with questions about what they did. And 4, authority. At my hearing, my boss wasn't in charge. Sometimes she lost sight of that. Like when the judge asked her how many times she had actually allowed me to use telework as a reasonable accommodation. She said several times. The judge asked how she knew it had been several times. And when she couldn't think of an answer, she delegated to NASA's attorney. She turned to her and said, "I need you to answer this one." The judge was like, "Hey, you're the witness. I asked you." There were a few moments like that when he had to stop and remind her who was in charge. At one point, she was openly arguing with the judge about whether or not he was irritated with her. I think that sort of behavior helped my case. I mean, a person who'll treat a judge like that in his own proceeding, it's not hard to imagine how they might treat a subordinate when nobody's looking. Of course, you can't make your employer annoy the judge. But if your boss is really arrogant, you can count on them to do it for you. Not many things are more frustrating than dealing with an arrogant boss who's trying to trample on your rights. But as annoying as it is, it could help your case. When your employer reveals who they are, shine a light on it. It could cast doubt on their credibility, and that'll definitely work in your favor. Fight smart and hang in to win.